The midday sun beat down on the bustling street, the air thick with the scent of exhaust fumes and street food. Sue Jenner, clutching a worn textbook to her chest, hurried along the sidewalk, her mind a whirlwind of anxieties. The weight of her situation pressed heavily upon her, the looming due date, the dwindling funds, her family's incessant demands. A wave of nausea washed over her, a stark reminder of the life growing within her. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing the dizziness to pass. Just a little further, she told herself. Just a little further to the university library, a sanctuary of quiet amidst the chaos. Then, a sudden commotion. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Sue Jenner's eyes snapped open to see an elderly woman crumpling to the pavement, her face ashen. A collective intake of breath, fear, hesitation, morbid curiosity hung in the air. People shuffled, murmured, but no one moved forward. Sue Jenner felt a jolt, a strange mix of fear and adrenaline. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, a protective gesture. But then, another instinct kicked in. The first aid training she'd received years ago resurfaced, a muscle memory pushing her forward. "Grandma," she cried out, dropping to her knees beside the woman. The elderly woman's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. A pang of empathy shot through Sue Jenner. This woman, a stranger, suddenly felt connected to her, both vulnerable in the harsh glare of the midday sun. "Grandma, wake up," Sue Jenner repeated, her voice trembling slightly. She checked for a pulse, her fingers fumbling slightly. Weak, but there. Relief washed over her, a small victory against the rising panic. "Someone call an ambulance," she shouted, her voice gaining strength. The crowd seemed to awaken from its stupor. A man in a business suit fumbled for his phone. "This girl is really brave," a woman whispered nearby, her voice laced with admiration. Sue Jenner barely registered the comment. Her focus was entirely on the woman in front of her. She gently tilted the woman's head back, checking her airway. Years of caring for her ailing grandmother had instilled in her a practical calmness in the face of crisis. This wasn't just about helping a stranger, it was about reclaiming some sense of control in a world that felt increasingly out of her grasp. The siren wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Sue Jenner stayed by the elderly woman's side, murmuring reassurances she wasn't sure the woman could hear. The crowd parted as paramedics rushed forward, their practiced efficiency a stark contrast to the earlier hesitancy. Sue Jenner stepped back, feeling a strange emptiness now that the adrenaline had faded. She watched as they lifted the woman onto a stretcher, her face still pale and drawn. A hand touched her shoulder. She turned to see a man in a crisp white coat, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just relieved." She realized her hands were shaking. The weight of her own worries returned, crashing down on her like a wave. The man introduced himself as Dr. Fu, the vice president of Fu's hospital. His eyes, dark and intense, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. He thanked her for her quick thinking and assured her the elderly woman was in good hands. His words were formal, polite, yet there was an underlying current of something else. Concern? Gratitude? Sue Jenner couldn't be sure. "She's my grandmother," he added, his voice softening slightly. Sue Jenner felt a jolt of surprise. This elegant, powerful man was connected to the frail woman she had just helped. The world, it seemed, was full of unexpected connections. He insisted on driving her to the university, dismissing her protests with a quiet authority. Inside the luxurious car, the silence felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Sue Jenner stared out the window, the city lights blurring past. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the afternoon. She had acted instinctively, driven by compassion and a sense of duty. But now, sitting beside this powerful man, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had taken an unexpected turn. Days turned into weeks. Su Jiner found herself drawn into the orbit of the Fu family. Grandma Li Te, surprisingly recovered, insisted on meeting her savior. Their meetings, initially formal, gradually warmed into something akin to friendship. Grandma Li Te, beneath her shrewd exterior, revealed a surprising vulnerability, a deep-seated loneliness that resonated with Su Jiner's own. Fu Zichen, too, became a constant presence. He would appear at the university, ostensibly to check on his grandmother's health, but their conversations would drift to other topics: her studies, her dreams, her worries. His initial reserve melted away, replaced by a quiet attentiveness that both intrigued and unsettled her. He listened with a rare intensity, his gaze unwavering, as if trying to decipher the secrets hidden beneath her carefully constructed facade. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a bright, crisp autumn afternoon. Su Jiner was walking across the Taikyo University campus when she saw a crowd gathered near the fountain. Music drifted through the air, a familiar melody that tugged at her heartstrings. As she drew closer, she saw Fu Zichen standing in the center of the crowd, a microphone in his hand. His usually composed demeanor was replaced by a nervous energy, a vulnerability she had never seen before. He spoke, his voice amplified through the speakers, his words echoing across the quad. He spoke of fate, of unexpected encounters, of a young woman whose courage and kindness had touched his heart. He spoke of Su Jiner. Her breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only his voice, his words, his gaze fixed on her. He descended from the makeshift stage, the crowd parting as he walked towards her. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers. He took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "Su Jiner," he said, his voice soft yet firm, "will you marry me?" The world erupted in cheers. Confetti rained down from the sky, a vibrant explosion of color against the clear blue backdrop. Su Jiner stood there, stunned, her mind reeling. This wasn't the future she had envisioned. This wasn't the life she had planned. But as she looked into Fu Zichen's eyes, she saw a sincerity, a depth of emotion that mirrored her own. She saw a future she hadn't dared to dream of, a future filled with love, acceptance, and the promise of a new beginning. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the crowd. "Yes, I will." The antiseptic scent of the hospital corridor, sharp and sterile, did little to cleanse the bitter taste rising in Su Jiner's mouth. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a cold, impersonal glow on the pale green walls. Each echoing footstep seemed to amplify the hollowness in her chest. Just moments ago, she'd been cradled in a fragile hope, a tentative belief that perhaps, just perhaps, her future wouldn't be as bleak as she'd imagined. Now, facing her mother's hardened gaze, that hope withered like a flower deprived of sunlight. "I used all the money in your card for your brother." Her mother's voice, usually shrill and demanding, was surprisingly calm, almost matter-of-fact. As if discussing the weather, not the systematic dismantling of her daughter's precarious financial stability. Su Jiner's hand instinctively went to her belly, a protective gesture. The faint flutter beneath her palm, a reminder of the life growing within her, fueled a sudden surge of anger. The money for the checkups for the baby," the words caught in her throat, strangled by a rising tide of despair. She had scrimped and saved, sacrificing meals and necessities, to ensure her child would receive the best possible care. Now, it was all gone. Her mother clicked her tongue, a sound that grated on Su Jiner's nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Your brother needed it. His business, it's a crucial time." The familiar justification, always prioritizing her brother's whims over Su Jiner's needs. A bitter laugh escaped Su Jiner's lips. A hollow, empty sound that echoed the emptiness within her. Crucial. His gambling debts are always crucial, mother. How many times have I bailed him out? And now, when I need it most, her voice trailed off, the futility of arguing with her mother a heavy weight in her chest. It was a well-rehearsed dance, a cycle of manipulation and guilt that had played out countless times throughout her life. Sue Jenner, the dutiful daughter, always giving, always sacrificing. And her mother, the insatiable black hole, consuming everything in her path. Don't give me that look, Jenner. Her mother's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. You think I enjoy doing this? Your brother is family. He needs our support. The word family felt like a twisted mockery on her mother's lips. What kind of family bleeds its own dry? What kind of love demands such constant, crippling sacrifice? Sue Jenner swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Support? He's 30 years old, mother. When will he learn to stand on his own 2 feet? Don't you talk back to me. Her mother's voice rose an octave, shattering the tense quiet of the corridor. A few nurses glanced their way, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Sue Jenner flinched, the sudden outburst a painful reminder of her powerlessness. You want me to pay you back? Don't even think about it. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. A guillotine severing the last thread of hope. Sue Jenner closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. The sterile scent of the hospital, once a symbol of hope and healing, now felt suffocating. The hum of the fluorescent lights morphed into a mocking drone, amplifying the deafening silence in her own mind. She felt a hand on her arm, a tentative touch. Opening her eyes, she saw a young nurse, her face etched with concern. Are you all right, miss? Sue Jenner managed a weak smile, a brittle facade masking the turmoil within. I'm fine, she lied, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. She turned away from her mother, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. Each step she took felt heavy, leaden. The weight of her mother's betrayal, the crushing reality of her financial situation, the fear for her unborn child, it all pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. As she walked, the image of Fu Zichen's face flashed through her mind. His cool gaze, his measured words, the strange mixture of distance and concern he had shown. He had offered her a lifeline, a way out of her desperate situation. But at what cost? The thought of being bound to him, of becoming a pawn in his family's elaborate game, filled her with unease. Yet, what choice did she have? She glanced down at her belly, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell. For her child, she would endure anything. Even a gilded cage. Even a loveless marriage. The bustling streets outside the hospital offered little solace. The city noise, usually a vibrant backdrop to her life, now felt jarring, intrusive. Each passing face seemed to blur into a sea of indifference. She was alone, adrift in a world that cared little for her struggles. The weight of her solitude pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Reaching her small, sparsely furnished apartment, she sank onto the worn couch, the springs groaning beneath her weight. The silence of the room, usually a welcome respite, now felt oppressive. The four walls seemed to close in on her, mirroring the suffocating sense of hopelessness that gripped her heart. What was she going to do? The question echoed in the silence, unanswered, unresolved. She closed her eyes, picturing her mother's face, the callous indifference in her eyes. The image burned in her mind, a searing reminder of the family she had, the family that had failed her. And then, another image surfaced, pushing aside the bitterness and resentment. Fu Zichen. His face, though impassive, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Was it pity? Concern? Or something else entirely? She didn't know. But in that moment, in the desolate emptiness of her apartment, the thought of him, of his offer, was the only flicker of light in the encroaching darkness. The opulent waiting room of Fu's hospital hummed with a low, almost reverent hush. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering patterns across the polished marble floor, reflecting in the pristine white walls. Grandma Lite sat regally on a plush armchair, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. A faint scent of antiseptic mingled with her expensive perfume, creating a sterile yet strangely powerful aura. These girls so eager, so predictable. She tapped a long, jade-green fingernail against the armrest, the rhythmic click a counterpoint to the anxious flutter in her chest. A great-grandson. It was all she desired. A legacy secured, a future guaranteed. A parade of young women, each more impeccably dressed than the last, filed past her. They offered hesitant smiles, their eyes darting towards the closed door of Fu Zichen's office. Each one a potential vessel, a carrier of the Fu family name. Grandma Lite observed them with a practiced eye, dissecting their posture, their expressions, their very essence. Too eager. Too shallow. Too modern. She sighed internally, the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. Su Jiner stood awkwardly near the reception desk, clutching a worn handbag. The pristine environment of the hospital felt alien, a stark contrast to the cramped apartment she shared with her demanding mother and brother. The air conditioning sent a shiver down her spine, despite the summer heat outside. Just a quick checkup, she told herself, trying to ignore the curious glances of the nurses. Just make sure the baby is healthy. The weight of her unborn child, both a burden and a blessing, settled heavily in her belly. She hadn't planned this, not like this. But now, here she was, navigating a world she barely understood. A nurse, her expression carefully neutral, approached Su Jiner. "Miss Su, the doctor is ready for you now." Relief washed over Su Jiner, momentarily eclipsing the gnawing anxiety about the medical bills. She followed the nurse down a pristine corridor, the rhythmic squeak of her shoes echoing in the hushed hallway. As they passed Grandma Lite's waiting area, the old woman's sharp gaze briefly landed on Su Jiner before dismissing her. Just another patient, she thought dismissively. Not one of them. Inside Fu Zichen's office, the atmosphere was cool and professional. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in a subdued light. Fu Zichen sat behind his large desk, his face partially obscured by the glow of his computer screen. He looked up as his grandmother ushered in another hopeful candidate. A flicker of weariness crossed his features, quickly masked by a polite smile. He had endured this charade for weeks, a silent participant in his grandmother's relentless quest. Each meeting felt like a hollow echo of the last, a performance devoid of genuine connection. Another one, he thought, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the polished wood of his desk. Will this ever end? He engaged in the perfunctory pleasantries, his mind already drifting elsewhere. His grandmother's machinations felt suffocating, a gilded cage built of tradition and expectation. He longed for a genuine connection, a love born of choice, not obligation. But such desires seemed like a distant dream in the face of his family's unwavering demands. After the last candidate had left, a nurse hesitantly approached Grandma Lite. "The old lady found you so many rich girls," she began, her voice laced with a hint of awe. Another nurse chimed in, "This girl is cute. Very suitable." A sudden realization dawned on one of them. Where is the pregnant woman who was taking care of the old lady just now? Grandma Lite's eyes narrowed, a flicker of calculation crossing her face. The pregnant girl. The one she had dismissed so readily. A subtle shift occurred within her. A different kind of plan began to form, one that was bolder, more decisive. A faint smile played on her lips. Perhaps, she mused, fate has intervened. Meanwhile, Su Jiner sat in the waiting area, clutching a small, blurry ultrasound image. A wave of nausea washed over her, a familiar morning sickness pang. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The financial burden weighed heavily on her, a constant source of anxiety. Her family's demands were relentless, a bottomless pit of need she couldn't seem to fill. I need to find a way, she thought, a desperate resolve hardening her gaze. For my baby, I will do whatever it takes. Unaware of the wheels already in motion, Sujina remained lost in her own world of worry and uncertainty. The grand scheme unfolding around her, the intricate web of family secrets and unspoken desires, remained hidden, a silent storm gathering on the horizon. The sterile, hushed atmosphere of Fu's hospital held a secret that would soon change Sujina's life forever. The click of Grandma Li T's jade nails echoed in the opulent waiting room, a silent promise of a future yet to be written. A future where manipulation and genuine affection would intertwine, a future where destiny would be rewritten within the sterile walls of Fu's hospital. The antiseptic smell of Fu's hospital, usually a sterile comfort, now suffocated Sujina. Her hand, protectively cradling the slight swell of her belly, trembled almost imperceptibly. The crisp white walls, the gleaming floors, the hushed efficiency, they all mocked her worn canvas bag and the frayed edges of her simple blouse. Earlier, a nurse with a smile as brittle as porcelain had directed her to administration for her appointment with the specialist, a term that echoed with an unnerving vagueness in her mind. Now, faced with the impassive face of the receptionist, a young woman whose perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite mask the disdain in her eyes, Sujina felt a familiar chill of apprehension crawl up her spine. "I'm here to see about the arrangement," she mumbled, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The receptionist's meticulously arched eyebrows rose a fraction. "Arrangement?" she repeated, her voice laced with a sugary sweetness that somehow felt more cutting than outright rudeness. Sujina swallowed, the lump in her throat constricting her breath. She hated this feeling of being sized up, dissected, and found wanting. "Yes," she managed, forcing a sliver of steel into her voice, "the one concerning prenatal care." The receptionist tapped manicured nails against her keyboard, her gaze fixed on the screen. "Name?" Sujina gave it, each syllable a small victory against the rising tide of her anxiety. The clicking stopped. The receptionist looked up, a thin smile playing on her lips. "I see no such appointment. Are you sure you're at the right hospital?" Sujina's stomach clenched. "No. This couldn't be happening. Not after everything. Not after the hushed phone calls, the veiled promises, the weight of her family's expectant gazes. There must be some mistake," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I was told to come here. Today." "Well," the receptionist said, her smile widening, revealing teeth that were a little too perfect, "we don't typically cater to walk-ins. Especially those without proper insurance." Her eyes flicked down, taking in Sujina's attire with an almost imperceptible sneer. A wave of hot shame washed over Sujina. How dare they? How dare they judge her based on appearances? All the carefully constructed composure, the practiced indifference she had painstakingly cultivated over the past few months, crumbled. Since when did hospitals start to discriminate against patients' identities? Her voice, though trembling, carried an unexpected resonance. "I have a confirmed appointment." "Check again." The receptionist's smile faltered. "How dare you talk back to me," she hissed, her voice losing its saccharine edge. "Do you know who I?" The sharp, metallic click of a door opening cut her off. Sujina's gaze snapped towards the sound. Fu Zichen stood in the doorway of his office, his expression unreadable. He was impeccably dressed, as always, his presence radiating an aura of quiet power that seemed to instantly fill the room. The receptionist's face paled. "Mr. Fu," she stammered, her carefully constructed facade cracking under his gaze. he didn't acknowledge her. His eyes, dark and inscrutable, met Sue Jenner's. For a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of something in their depths: recognition. Pity. She couldn't quite decipher it. He turned to the receptionist, his voice low and controlled. "Is there a problem?" The receptionist floundered, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of explanations. Sue Jenner tuned her out, her mind racing. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this man held her future, and her child's, in his hands. The hushed phone calls, the veiled promises, they all led back to him. She watched him, her heart pounding against her ribs, a strange mixture of fear and hope swirling within her. Fu Zichen listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When the receptionist finally finished, he simply said, "See that this doesn't happen again." His tone, though calm, held an undercurrent of steel that left no room for argument. The receptionist, her face now a mask of mortification, mumbled an apology and quickly disappeared into a back room. He turned to Sue Jenner, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Please," he said, gesturing towards his office. "Come in." His voice was still devoid of warmth, but there was a subtle shift, a hint of something softer, beneath the surface. Sue Jenner hesitated, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She wanted to run, to escape the suffocating weight of this situation. But she also knew that she couldn't. Her future, and her child's, depended on this meeting. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into his office. Later that day, the whispers started. First within the confines of Fu's hospital, then spreading like wildfire through the interconnected network of Taikyo University's student body. The rumors, fueled by speculation and embellished with each retelling, painted a picture of a dramatic confrontation, a powerful man, and a mysterious young woman. The reality, as it unfolded beneath the sprawling oak trees of Taikyo University's central quad, was both simpler and more profound. The afternoon sun dappled the ground, casting long shadows as Fu Zichen stood before Sue Jenner, a single red rose held loosely in his hand. The crowd, a mix of curious students and bewildered hospital staff, held its collective breath. Sue Jenner, her hand still instinctively resting on her belly, looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a burgeoning understanding. "Sue Jenner," he began, his voice, usually reserved, carrying clearly across the hushed quad. "I know this is unconventional." He paused, a fleeting smile touching his lips. "But life rarely follows a conventional path." He took a step closer, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Will you marry me?" The silence that followed was absolute. Then, a single gasp broke the spell, followed by a ripple of murmurs that quickly escalated into a full-blown roar of astonishment. Sue Jenner's mind reeled. Just hours ago, she had been standing in the sterile lobby of his hospital, a nameless, faceless girl facing judgment and dismissal. Now, here she was, the center of attention, the object of a public proposal from one of the most eligible bachelors in the city. The irony wasn't lost on her. But beyond the shock, beyond the swirling confusion, a different emotion began to take root. Looking into Fu Zichen's eyes, seeing the sincerity reflected there, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile tendril of something that might, just might, blossom into love. She thought of her child, of the future she had been so desperately trying to secure. And in that moment, beneath the dappled sunlight and the watchful gaze of the crowd, she knew her answer. The cool air conditioning of Fu's hospital offered a stark contrast to the simmering anxiety in Sue Jenner's chest. The pristine white walls, the hushed whispers, the sterile scent of antiseptic, none of it calmed the frantic fluttering of her heart. Her fingers, clutching a crumpled tissue, felt damp. She'd rehearsed this encounter countless times in her cramped apartment, in the crowded bus, even in the echoing silence of the university bathroom. Each rehearsal had ended differently, each outcome a reflection of her fluctuating hopes and deepening desperation. Now, facing the closed door of Fu Zichen's examination room, the carefully constructed script seemed to dissolve into meaningless syllables. She glanced at the small, printed number in her hand: 17. 17. A number that held the fragile weight of her future, the future she hadn't dared to dream of until her mother's shrill voice had pierced through her fragile peace. A way out, her mother had called it, a solution to their mounting debts, a lifeline to a better life. A life that required Su Jiner to become a pawn in a game she barely understood. The electronic display above the door flickered, displaying the number 16. Su Jiner took a deep breath, the sterile air catching in her throat. Her stomach churned, a knot of unease tightening with each passing second. She adjusted the cheap, oversized cardigan she wore, a pathetic attempt to conceal the subtle curve of her belly. Shame, a familiar companion, coiled within her. Shame for the circumstances, shame for the lies she was about to tell, shame for the desperation that had driven her here. The display changed to 17. Her number. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, the smooth, cool metal a stark reminder of the cold, calculated nature of the plan. What was she doing? Trading her body, her future, for a fleeting promise of stability? The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. She almost turned back, almost fled back to the chaotic mess of her life, but the image of her mother's face, twisted with a mixture of desperation and expectation, held her rooted to the spot. With a final, shaky breath, she pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the soft glow of fluorescent lights, the stark white walls adorned with framed medical certificates. The air was thick with the clinical scent of disinfectant, a smell that now seemed to carry the weight of her impending deception. Behind a large, polished desk sat Fu Zichen, his head bent over a file, his dark hair falling across his forehead. He looked even more imposing in person than in the photographs Grandma Li Te had shown her, his features sharp and defined, his expression unreadable. He looked up as she entered, his gaze cool and assessing. Su Jiner felt a shiver run down her spine. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed facade, seeing the fear and vulnerability she desperately tried to hide. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and resonant, devoid of any warmth. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders, a voice that demanded respect and obedience. "Hello, Dr. Fu," she managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. The rehearsed lines vanished, replaced by a wave of crippling self-consciousness. He gestured towards the chair opposite his desk. "Please, have a seat." She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of his pen against the desk. Each tap felt like a hammer blow against her fragile composure. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze questioning. "So, how can I help you today?" The lie, pre-packaged and ready for delivery, stuck in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She had to say something, anything, to break the suffocating tension. "Dr. Fu," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I have irregular menstruation." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. She watched his face, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of understanding, but his expression remained impassive. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "And how long has this been happening?" A few weeks," she lied, her voice barely audible. The shame burned in her cheeks, a hot, prickly sensation. He continued his questioning, his tone professional, detached. Each question felt like an interrogation, each answer a further descent into the web of deceit. The antiseptic scent of Fu's hospital, usually a sterile comfort, choked Su Jiner. Each breath felt like swallowing shards of glass, reflecting her fractured thoughts. The pristine white walls, the hushed whispers of nurses, the rhythmic beeping of machines, they all mocked her precarious situation. Just hours ago, she'd sat in that sterile examination room, the ultrasound technician's words echoing in her ears, healthy and strong. A life growing inside her, a life she desperately wanted but couldn't afford. Her fingers traced the outline of her slightly swollen belly, a mixture of tenderness and fear warring within her. Her phone vibrated, a shrill reminder of the other life draining her dry. "Where's the money, Gina? Your brother needs it. Now." Her mother's voice, sharp and demanding, pierced through the hospital's quiet hum. Gina closed her eyes, the familiar wave of resentment washing over her. Always needing, always taking. Had they ever asked how she was supposed to survive, let alone provide for them? "I'm trying, Ma," Gina whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of a nearby curtain. "It's not that easy." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Easy? Nothing had been easy since that night, since the fleeting moment of recklessness that now bound her to a future she couldn't comprehend. "Don't give me excuses," her mother snapped. "Your brother has debts. Serious debts. You owe us this, Gina. You owe us." The phone clicked dead, leaving Gina trembling in the echoing silence of the hospital corridor. Owe them? What about what they owed her? Years of emotional manipulation, financial dependence, a childhood stolen by their selfish needs. The resentment churned, a bitter acid burning through her. She stumbled towards the hospital cafeteria, the fluorescent lights glaring harshly. The aroma of cheap coffee and stale pastries did little to soothe her churning stomach. She needed to think, to find a way out. The clinical trial Dr. Lin's offer echoed in her mind. A substantial sum of money, enough to appease her family, enough to give her child a fighting chance. But at what cost? A wave of nausea washed over her, a visceral rejection of the idea. Her body, her child's sanctuary, violated for money. The thought was repulsive. Across the room, she saw him. Fu Zichen. The aloof vice president, a man shrouded in an aura of power and wealth. He sat alone, his gaze fixed on a document in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. He seemed a world away, untouchable, yet their paths had crossed in the most unexpected, intimate way. He represented a solution, a twisted, desperate solution, but a solution nonetheless. "I need money but I'm not selling it," she muttered under her breath, the words a defiant whisper against the gnawing fear. Unknown to Gina, Grandma Lite, a woman whose will could bend steel, observed from a discreet distance. Her sharp eyes, aged but unwavering, followed Gina's every move. A subtle smile played on her lips. The pieces were falling into place, just as she'd planned. The girl was desperate, predictable. Perfect. The family lineage, the Fu name, would continue. A great-grandson. Her legacy secured. The phone call to Gina's mother had been a calculated move, another nudge in the right direction. Grandma Lite understood desperation. She knew how to exploit it. Money was a powerful weapon, and she wielded it with ruthless precision. Later that day, a sleek black car pulled up to the gates of Taikyo University. Fu Zichen emerged, his presence immediately drawing attention. Students whispered, their eyes following his every move. He was a figure of fascination, a symbol of success and privilege. Kujamin, radiant and elegant, waited near the fountain, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. This was supposed to be their day. A public declaration of their love, a promise of a future together. But Fu Zichen's gaze was distant, his thoughts miles away. He saw not the admiring glances, not the meticulously planned backdrop of the university's iconic clock tower. He saw Su Jiner's face, etched with worry and exhaustion. He heard her whispered plea, I need money. The image clashed sharply with the meticulously crafted narrative of his life, the expected trajectory of a fou heir. Yet, a strange sense of responsibility, a protectiveness he couldn't quite explain, had taken root within him. Grandma Lite watched from the sidelines, a satisfied glint in her eyes. The stage was set. The actors in position. The final act was about to begin. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Or so she thought. For in the heart of Fu Zichen, a change, subtle yet profound, was taking place. A shift in perspective, a reevaluation of priorities. The carefully constructed walls around his heart were beginning to crumble, revealing a depth of emotion that even he hadn't realized existed. The carefully laid plans of the matriarch were about to collide with the unpredictable force of genuine human connection. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the silence before the storm. The antiseptic scent of the hospital, usually a comfort to Su Jiner, now felt suffocating. Each sterile white wall, each gleaming chrome surface, seemed to press in, a physical manifestation of the invisible cage she found herself in. Her hand, resting protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach, trembled slightly. Earlier, Grandma Li Ti's words, laced with honeyed promises, echoed in her mind. Security, a future for her child, an end to the constant fear that clawed at her. But at what cost? A nurse, starched and crisp in her uniform, approached, her smile brittle. "Miss Su. Mr. Fu would like to see you in his office." Jiner's heart stuttered. This was it. The beginning of whatever this was going to be. She swallowed, the dryness in her throat making it difficult. Of course. Her voice, she noted with a flicker of surprise, was steady. Inside, though, a storm raged. Doubts warred with a desperate hope, fear with the primal need to protect her unborn child. Fu Zichen's office was a study in contrasts. The sleek, modern lines of the furniture, the expansive view of the city sprawling below, clashed with the antique calligraphy scroll hanging on the wall, a silent testament to the weight of family legacy. He sat behind his large desk, an island of calm in the turbulent sea of Jiner's anxieties. His gaze, sharp and assessing, met hers. "Please, sit down." Jiner perched on the edge of the plush chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Fu," she began, but he cut her off with a curt nod. "Everything is arranged, as agreed." His voice was devoid of inflection, a carefully constructed wall shielding whatever lay beneath. Jiner nodded, unsure what to say. The details of the agreement were a blur in her mind, a hazy concoction of financial support, medical care, and a future she hadn't dared to dream of just days ago. As he spoke, laying out the next steps, Jiner found herself increasingly detached. His words, precise and clinical, seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier around her. He was speaking a language she understood, yet didn't. The language of wealth, of power, of a world she had only glimpsed from the outside. A world where a child, her child, could become a pawn in a larger game. Later, in the hushed quiet of the hospital lounge, Jiner overheard a whispered conversation. Two nurses, their heads bent close together, their voices low, sent a chill down her spine. "Is she the woman chosen by the old lady for Mr. Fu?" one murmured. The other nodded, her eyes flitting towards Jiner. "This is the sleeping incense that the old lady requested." Sleeping incense. Jiner's breath hitched. What was happening? The pieces of the puzzle, so carefully presented by Grandma Lite, suddenly shifted, their edges no longer fitting. A sense of unease, a premonition of something deeply wrong, settled in her gut. She stood abruptly, the movement sharp and sudden, drawing the nurse's attention. They fell silent, their faces masks of polite indifference. Jiner's mind raced. Sleeping incense. Chosen. Old lady. The words swirled in a chaotic dance, forming a horrifying picture. Was she not chosen for her circumstances, her vulnerability? Was she a replacement? A substitute for someone else? Her hand flew to her stomach, her protective instinct flaring. She had to leave. She had to get away from this place, from these people who smiled and spoke of futures while weaving webs of deceit. She stumbled towards the exit, the whispers of the nurses fading behind her, replaced by the pounding of her own heart. The clean, sterile air of the hospital, once a promise of healing, now tasted of betrayal. The fear, initially a dull ache, sharpened into a piercing point. She couldn't breathe. The weight of her decision, the desperation that had driven her into this bargain, threatened to crush her. What had she done? Had she condemned herself and her child to a life of gilded captivity? Gina's phone buzzed in her pocket, a jarring intrusion into the chaotic symphony of her thoughts. It was her mother, her voice shrill and demanding. "Gina. Did you get the money? Your brother needs it. Now." Gina closed her eyes, the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. This was her reality, the stark truth that had driven her to the Fu family's doorstep. She was trapped, caught between the devil she knew and the one she was just beginning to understand. The choice she had made, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a noose tightening around her neck. And in the quiet solitude of her fear, a single, terrifying thought took root: what if she was making a terrible mistake? What if she was walking into a trap far more intricate and dangerous than she could ever imagine? The unknown, once a terrifying prospect, now seemed almost preferable to the chilling clarity of the situation unfolding before her. The game, she realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach, had just begun. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Tokyo University. Gina clutched her worn textbooks to her chest, the weight of familiar comfort against the gnawing unease in her stomach. The encounter at Fu's hospital with Grandma Li-Te had left her shaken, the veiled threats and promises of financial security swirling in her mind like a disorienting dream. She told herself it was just the stress of her situation, the constant worry about her family's insatiable demands. But something else, a prickling intuition, whispered that there was more to the story, something hidden beneath the polished surface of the Fu family's concern. A gaggle of students brushed past, their laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. Gina felt a pang of isolation. Their carefree chatter, their discussions about weekend plans and upcoming exams, seemed to belong to a different world, one she no longer inhabited. The weight of her secret, the growing life within her, set her apart. She ran a hand over her still flat abdomen, a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness swelling in her heart. Just as she reached the steps of the main library, a voice, sharp and familiar, cut through the afternoon hum. "Gina." Her mother's shrill tone sent a shiver down her spine. Beside her stood her brother, his usual smirk plastered on his face. Gina's heart sank. Their presence here could only mean one thing: more demands, more pressure. "What are you doing here?" Gina asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Her mother's face contorted in a dramatic display of distress. "What kind of question is that? We're your family. We're worried about you." The words dripped with false concern, the underlying message clear: they were here for money. Gina's brother, ever the pragmatist, cut to the chase. "Did you talk to the old lady about the arrangement?" He glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. Gina's cheeks burned. The arrangement. The carefully orchestrated plan to secure the Fu family's heir, and in return, secure her family's financial future. She hadn't told them about the hospital encounter, about Grandma Li-Te's strange intensity, about the unease that had settled deep in her bones. I spoke to her," she stammered, avoiding their gaze. The lie felt heavy on her tongue. A limousine pulled up to the curb, its sleek black surface gleaming in the sunlight. Gina's breath hitched. The Fu family crest, emblazoned on the door, seemed to mock her with its silent power. Grandma Lite emerged from the vehicle, followed by Fu Zichen. His presence sent a jolt of electricity through her. He looked different here, outside the sterile confines of the hospital. The afternoon sun softened his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his face. Her family, momentarily stunned into silence, watched as Fu Zichen approached. He moved with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. Gina's mind raced. What was happening? This wasn't part of the plan. Grandma Lite, her eyes sharp and assessing, surveyed the scene. A flicker of something amusement. Satisfaction. Crossed her face. "Ah, Gina," she said, her voice laced with a calculated warmth. "So glad we found you." Gina's mother, recovering from her initial shock, plastered a sycophantic smile on her face. "Mrs. Fu. What a pleasant surprise." She elbowed Gina's brother, who mumbled a greeting. Their sudden shift in demeanor, from demanding relatives to obsequious sycophants, made Gina's stomach churn. Fu Zichen stopped before Gina, his gaze intense and unwavering. The air crackled with an unspoken tension. Gina's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She could feel the curious stares of the surrounding students, their whispers like buzzing insects. A strange sense of unreality washed over her. This was all happening too fast. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small velvet box. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden hush. Gina's mind went blank. The world seemed to narrow to the small, open box in his hand, the diamond inside glittering like a captured star. "Su Gina," Fu Zichen's voice, clear and resonant, cut through the stunned silence. "Will you marry me?" The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Gina's breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. The carefully constructed facade of the arrangement, the veiled threats, the promises of financial security, it all seemed to crumble around her, replaced by something raw and unexpected. He wasn't supposed to do this. Not here. Not like this. The plan was for a quiet, discreet arrangement, a transaction disguised as a marriage. This was a declaration. She looked at him, searching his eyes for an answer, for a clue to the enigma that he had become. His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering, a flicker of something vulnerable hope. In their depths, a wave of conflicting emotions crashed over her, confusion, fear, a strange, burgeoning sense of hope. She looked at her family, their faces a mixture of shock and avarice. Then she looked back at Fu Zichen, at the silent question in his eyes. The answer, she realized, wasn't about the money, or the family, or the elaborate schemes. It was about something else entirely. Something she hadn't dared to hope for. The words, barely a whisper, escaped her lips. Yes. The antiseptic scent of the hospital clung to Su Gina's clothes, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within her. She sat on the edge of the crisp white hospital bed, the starched sheets rustling beneath her restless hands. Grandma Liti's words echoed in her ears, each syllable a carefully placed stone in a mosaic of manipulation. They wanted her baby. They wanted an heir. And they were willing to pay any price. A bitter taste rose in her throat. Was this her future? A gilded cage, trading her freedom for her child's security? Fu Zichen stood by the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the cityscape. He seemed impossibly distant, a world away from the gentle concern he'd shown just moments before. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Su Gina's gaze drifted to the ultrasound image clutched in her hand, the blurry outline of her unborn child, a stark reminder of the weight of her decisions. A tear traced a hot path down her cheek. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to become a pawn in their game. Fu Zichen turned, his expression unreadable. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw. He crossed the room, his footsteps measured and deliberate, each one seeming to reverberate in the quiet room. He stopped before her, his gaze intense, searching. "Jeanner," he began, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. He hesitated, as if weighing each word before speaking. "There are things you need to know." Su Jeanner's heart hammered against her ribs. What more could there be? What other layers of deceit were waiting to be unveiled? She held her breath, her eyes fixed on his. He took a deep breath, the muscles in his throat working. "My grandmother, she orchestrated this. The scholarship, the apartment, it was all a means to an end." His voice was laced with a self-loathing that mirrored her own. A hollow laugh escaped Su Jeanner's lips. So it was true. All her suspicions, all her fears, confirmed in a single sentence. She felt a strange mix of relief and despair. Relief that the truth was finally out, despair at the realization that she was indeed trapped. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What part did you play?" His eyes flickered with pain. I knew. I allowed it." The admission hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I convinced myself it was for the best. For the family. For the child." Su Jeanner closed her eyes, the weight of his words crushing her. She had allowed herself a flicker of hope, a foolish belief that perhaps, just perhaps, his kindness had been genuine. But it was all a lie. A carefully constructed facade. A commotion erupted outside the room, the sharp clang of a dropped tray followed by a flurry of hushed voices. The door burst open, revealing Grandma Li Te, flanked by two stern-faced nurses and followed by Kujamin, her face pale and drawn. Grandma Li Te surveyed the scene, her gaze sharp and calculating. "Zichen," she said, her voice laced with steel. "We need to talk. Now." He didn't move, his gaze fixed on Su Jeanner. "There's nothing more to discuss," he said, his voice low and steady. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He hesitated for a moment, then gently took her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through her, a strange contrast to the icy dread that gripped her heart. Grandma Li Te's face hardened. "Zichen, don't be foolish. This girl," he cut her off, his voice rising, echoing in the sterile confines of the room. "The baby in Jeanner's belly is mine," he declared, his gaze unwavering. "I'll take her back to the Fu family." A stunned silence filled the room. Grandma Li Te's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Kujamin gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The nurses exchanged bewildered glances. Su Jeanner's mind reeled, struggling to process the sudden shift in the narrative. He was claiming her. Claiming her child. Grandma Li Te sputtered, her words choked with indignation. "Are you mad? This is preposterous. You were supposed to marry Jiamin." A flicker of something akin to amusement crossed Fu Zichen's face. "Jiamin understands," he said, his voice softening as he turned to his childhood sweetheart. Jiamin, though visibly shaken, nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on Su Jeanner. There was a strange understanding in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the unexpected turn of events. "Jeanner," Fu Zichen said, turning his attention back to Su Jeanner, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I know this is a lot to take in. But I promise you, I will take care of you. Both of you." Su Jeanner looked at him, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Disbelief warred with a fragile hope. Could she trust him? Could she believe that his words were genuine this time? She searched his eyes, seeking a glimpse of the truth beneath the carefully constructed facade. What she saw there surprised her. A vulnerability she hadn't seen before. A sincerity that resonated deep within her soul. Later, amidst the throngs of students milling about Tokyo University's sprawling campus, Fu Zichen knelt before Su Jina, a velvet box open in his hand. The diamond ring, sparkling under the afternoon sun, seemed to mirror the bewilderment in her eyes. The whispers and gasps of the surrounding crowd faded into a dull roar as she stared at him, at the man who had woven a web of deceit around her, the man who now offered her a future she hadn't dared to imagine. He gazed up at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. "Gina," he said, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the noise. "Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared history, the complex tapestry of lies and unexpected truths. Su Jina looked at him, at the man who had both deceived her and offered her salvation. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine smile, untainted by the shadows of the past. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." The antiseptic scent of Fu's hospital still clung to her, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air swirling fallen leaves around her ankles. Su Jina watched a small boy chase a stray balloon, his laughter echoing through the park, a poignant reminder of the life growing within her. It had only been a week since the tumultuous events at the hospital, a week that had reshaped her world in ways she could never have imagined. The weight of her family's greed, the suffocating desperation, seemed to have lifted, replaced by a fragile hope. Fu Zichen's actions, his quiet strength and unexpected tenderness, had cracked the icy shell around her heart, allowing a sliver of warmth to seep through. She remembered the stunned silence in the opulent hospital room as he faced down his grandmother, his voice low but unwavering, defending her, defending them. It was a moment that had redefined her understanding of him, of family, of everything. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, legal documents, and the slow, steady dismantling of Grandma Li T's meticulously crafted plan. The old woman, her iron will finally bent, had retreated, not with bitterness, but with a strange, almost wistful acceptance. Su Jina had seen it in her eyes, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even regret. The realization that control, no matter how tightly grasped, ultimately slipped through one's fingers like grains of sand. Her own family, stripped of their anticipated windfall, retreated back into the shadows of their own resentment. Their venomous words, once a constant barrage, faded into a distant hum, a dull ache she could almost ignore. The severance, while painful, was ultimately liberating. She was free. Fu Zichen, however, remained a constant presence. He visited her daily, not with the detached politeness of a business arrangement, but with a quiet attentiveness that both unsettled and comforted her. He spoke of the future, of nurseries painted in soft pastels, of tiny shoes and the scent of baby powder. He spoke of their future. Each word, each gesture, chipped away at her carefully constructed defenses, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. She found herself drawn to his calm demeanor, to the way his eyes, usually guarded, softened when he looked at her. He had taken her to Tokyo University, ostensibly to finalize some paperwork. The familiar campus, once a symbol of her aspirations and anxieties, now held a different significance. As they walked across the quad, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, a crowd began to gather. Confused, Su Jina looked at Fu Zichen, searching his face for an explanation. He stopped, his hand gently resting on her arm. "Jina," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying over the growing murmur of the crowd. His eyes, usually so reserved, now held a depth of emotion that made her heart pound in her chest. "I've loved you since the first time we met Grandma's birthday party. Remember?" A wave of heat flushed her cheeks. She did remember. The lavish party, the suffocating pressure, the way he had looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. She had dismissed it then as pity, or perhaps even disdain. Now, looking into his eyes, she saw the truth. He reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box. The crowd gasped, a ripple of excitement running through them. Sujiner's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't the calculated transaction she had envisioned. This was real. Grandma's birthday party is coming up in a few days, he continued, his voice gaining strength, his gaze unwavering. It feels fitting. Su Chiener, he corrected himself, a small smile playing on his lips, will you marry me? The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rustling leaves and the distant hum of the city. Sujiner's mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions battling for dominance. Shock, disbelief, and a burgeoning joy she hadn't dared to acknowledge. She looked at the expectant faces in the crowd, at the setting sun casting long shadows across the quad, and finally, back at Fu Zichen. His expression was open, vulnerable, waiting. Yes, she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips, yet echoing in the sudden hush. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of love. She hadn't realized how much she had yearned for this, for a genuine connection, for a future built on honesty and trust. He slipped the ring onto her finger, the cool metal a tangible symbol of their commitment. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a joyous symphony that filled the evening air. He pulled her close, his embrace warm and reassuring. In that moment, surrounded by strangers, Su Jiner felt truly seen, truly accepted, truly loved. The future stretched before them, uncertain yet promising, a blank canvas upon which they could paint their own story, a story of unexpected love, resilience, and the enduring power of the human heart. The antiseptic scent of the hospital was finally gone, replaced by the sweet fragrance of hope and the promise of a new beginning.